Welcome to my zero point 0.3 Endgame Lightning Arrow Ranger Guide, easily one of the most powerful builds in the league, with both incredible damage output and unmatched mobility. Today we're going to go over in detail how you can build this character from the ground up to take on juiced T15 maps, as well as all the challenges the Abyss League has to offer. And the best part is, it won't cost you hundreds of divines to do it. Starting off with the skill gems, we'll of course be talking about Lightning Arrow itself first. By the time you're done building this character, you'll basically be able to hold down this skill and casually walk through the endgame, deleting everything in your way. For supports, run Lightning Attunement for extra lightning damage, Rapid Attacks 2 for 25% more attack speed, and in the third socket, run Ambush. We're going to be stacking a lot of critical hit chance in this build. However, bows have very low base critical hit chance, so we're going to need all the help we can get if we want to cap it. And this 100% boost to critical hit chance does just that. It only functions when the enemy is on full life, but they're not going to live long enough to see a second attack. For the fourth slot, we want to boost how many enemies we can hit at the same time. And the best way to do that is to run Fork, which basically turns your bow into a shotgun capable of hitting tons of enemies within your cone of fire. Lastly, for your first perfect jeweler orb, run Stoicism for 20% more damage when you haven't dodge rolled recently. We're going to be riding around on a Rhoa and almost never need to dodge roll, so this is just free damage. To be clear, you won't need any perfect jeweler orbs to be effective. I'm just including this slot so you know what to do with them. If you're fighting a particularly tough boss, Ambush and Fork aren't going to do anything for you. Switch these out with Elemental Armament and Charged Shots 2 for more damage, or Charged Shots 1 for less damage but more mana sustain. This will be a decision you'll need to make for yourself depending on your unique relationship with mana. When not using these gems, I like to keep them on my bow shot for convenient swapping. Next is Lightning Rod. This is your main boss killer and answer to tough rares before you scale into one-shotting them with Lightning Arrow. You can use this skill to plant up to 20 rods into the ground at a time, multiplying the damage written on the tooltip for each rod detonated. For the supports, we focus on damage output with Lightning Attunement and Elemental Armament. Then slot Concentrated Area, shrinking the area of effect in exchange for more damage. For the fourth slot, use Deliberation, as our Rhoa Mount invalidates the penalty, just like with Stoicism, which will be slotting in if you've got the perfect Jeweler Orb for a fifth slot. Next, we'll be using Electrocuting Arrow. This skill embeds a rod into our target, causing all lightning damage inflicted to build up electrocution. When the electrocution triggers, the target is then stunned for 5 seconds, making this a great ability for locking down fast boss encounters. For supports, we run Rapid Attacks 3 for 35% increased attack speed, as the negative damage doesn't matter for this skill. We're using it purely for its utility. Second is Prolonged Duration, so we have to reapply this skill less often. For the third and fourth slots, we use Lightning Exposure and Potent Exposure to inflict bosses with a 26% reduction to lightning resistance for 8 seconds after being shocked by this skill, improving its utility. For our Mark skill, we'll be using Voltaic Mark. Early, this can be used for additional wave clear, but in the endgame, it's another ability you'll be baking into your bossing rotation for its increase to shock chance and shock magnitude. For the supports, we use Prolonged Duration to cut down how often we need to recast this ability, and Mark for Death to improve the physical damage portion of Lightning Arrow's damage through Armor Break. Moving on to the Spirit Gems, Herald of Thunder gains charges when killing shocked enemies. Those charges then fire lightning bolts, finishing off anything that manages to survive our lightning arrow. To maximize its damage output, slot in Elemental Armament, Lightning Attunement, and Elemental Focus. Herald of Thunder is already incapable of causing the shocked status on its own, so Elemental Focus has no negatives, becoming free damage. In the fourth slot, I like to use Overreach to increase its area of effect. As Herald of Thunder also cannot miss, the accuracy reduction has no impact. If you need more damage instead, or have a perfect Jeweler Orb to create a fifth slot, use Longshot for 35% more damage against distant targets. As your map clearing often deletes enemies as they just barely edge onto your screen, this has a lot of uptime. For survivability, we're using Wind Dancer for a 30% multiplicative increase to evasion rating at full stacks, as long as we don't get hit. When you do get hit, a blast of wind will fire, knocking back nearby enemies. When you see this happen, play a bit more carefully until Wind Dancer has a chance to stack back up. Support gems are magnified area 2 to improve the coverage of the knockback, blind to make it more difficult for enemies to hit us after triggering Wind Dancer, and knockback to increase the distance enemies are pushed away from us after landing a hit. If you have the extra spirit to spare, slot in Cannibalism 1 for some great health sustain on kill as well. Finally, getting to the Rhoa Mount, which really ramps up our clearing capability and mobility. It cancels 80% of all movement penalties and increases your movement speed by 15%. The Rhoa cannot be damaged while riding it. However, taking damage while mounted will build up your heavy stun meter located in the bottom left. If this fills up, you'll be knocked off and heavily stunned for a few seconds with your evasion disabled, likely resulting in death. You can make this less likely by stacking more maximum life and stun threshold where possible, and being more cautious around melee enemies, which inherently build up stun 50% faster. For supports, run Loyalty to transfer 10% of the damage you take to the Rhoa, and Meat Shield with Elemental Army to make the Rhoa more resistant to damage while dismounted. But if you have the currency for it, replacing these two with the Brutus Brain lineage support will make your Rhoa invincible, which is a nice quality of life, but for the most part, it's not mandatory. Now, moving on to the passive tree section for the build, you're using quite a few strength and intelligence gems, so as we move along, use your attribute nodes to fulfill those requirements as necessary, and otherwise fill the rest with dexterity. Start with Honed Instincts and Vile Wounds, then path into Primal Sundering, Maiming Strike, Acceleration, and Coming Calamity to secure damage in the early game. We then shift focus to survivability as you'll be deep into the campaign at this point. So we take the Wildcat, Bestial Skin to double the evasion granted by our body armor, and enhanced reflexes to increase our evasion and give us some deflection. After that, pick up Falcon Technique for a scaling attack speed bonus, then First Approach for an extremely large increase to the damage and critical hit chance of our attacks against enemies on full life. This synergizes very well with our ambush support gem on Lightning Arrow. After First Approach, head up to Kite Runner and prepare to do some backtracking, because at this point, it's going to be appropriate to grab Surging Currents and Storm Surge for some much needed lightning penetration to break through enemy resistances, followed up by Unbound Forces for more shock magnitude. By now, you should have a pretty solid quiver equipped, so grab up Master Fletching and Wrapped Quiver to increase the stats granted by it. If your quiver also has projectile speed as a prefix, you'll pick up Feathered Fletching to shift that speed into a damage bonus. And as a final side note, path to Inspiring Ally as soon as you get the Rhoa Mount online, to turn the Rhoa Mount's presence into a damage increase for you. It's at this point we're going to begin scaling into our endgame critical based build, as you'll be able to afford the gear and currencies to scale into it at this point. Start with Cooked and Sniper, then Heartbreaking, Struck Through, Heart Stopping, True Strike, For the Jugular, and Deadly Force, as all these provide critical damage or critical hit chance in some capacity. This will take you all the way to level 90, which is more than enough to dumpster any T15 maps, complete your endgame atlas, and basically any content in the game you want. Levels beyond 90 will be covered in the written version of this guide on Mobalytics First, linked down below, as the build updates for the late endgame. For the Ascendency, you'll obviously want to become a Deadeye, and then take Gathering Winds for the powerful Tailwind buff, providing you with a stacking 15% bonus to evasion, 1% movement speed, and 3% multiplicative skill speed up to 10 stacks, only fading if you take a hit, which thanks to our high mobility and evasion, isn't common. For the second Ascendency, take Projectile Proximity Specialization, and lock in Point Blank for a 20% multiplicative damage bonus at close range. For the third Ascendency, we take Endless Munitions, adding an extra projectile to all of our attacks, but most importantly to Lightning Rod, allowing us to ramp up our damage that much faster against bosses, and clear faster with the extra Lightning Arrow. For the fourth Ascendency, we take Wind Ward, giving us 30% damage mitigation at maximum Tailwind stacks, making us that much harder to one-shot. You'll have 3 jewel sockets to utilize with this tree, and while there are several strong unique jewels you could utilize, none of them are necessary to get this build up and running and far too expensive. Instead, opt for emeralds with companion damage to take further advantage of our inspiring ally Notable. Other powerful options for prefixes on jewels include evasion percentage, increased damage with bows, increased attack damage, or increased lightning damage. For the suffixes, look for critical hit chance with attacks, critical damage for attacks, attack speed with bows, or movement speed. But it is very early in the league, so expect to settle when it comes to your jewels and just look for 2 or 3 good modifiers total for now. We've now made it to the gearing section, and as this is an endgame build guide, our pieces are going to be much more particular than our previous leveling guide, especially because we need critical stats to scale with our passive tree. But none of the gear we're about to talk about will be particularly expensive or difficult to fund beyond some preliminary early mapping progression currency. Your bow is the most important part of your character and should include the extra arrow implicit to scale the number of lightning arrows and rods you fire. For prefixes, the bow should include any combination of flat physical damage, flat lightning damage, and percent physical damage lines, bringing the total DPS to at a minimum 200 when looking on the trade site. More is always better, but this is the minimum. It's also important we do not include any cold or fire damage in these prefixes, as our character doesn't penetrate other elemental resistances or scale other elemental damage well. These would be greatly diluted for us, so physical and lightning only. For the suffixes, the bow must include at least a 3% critical hit chance line, as critical hit chance on the bow is added directly to your base critical hit chance, vastly improving the value of all of your passive investments. The other 2 suffixes can be any combination of critical hit damage, attack speed, extra arrows, or projectile skill levels. However, projectile skill levels will greatly increase your mana costs, so be prepared to invest more into sustaining mana if your bow has this line, such as a sapphire with mana on kill. The quiver is your second most important piece. Ideally, this is a visceral quiver as they have a critical hit chance implicit, but the primed quiver is fine as well. For the prefixes, we want any combination of physical damage to attacks, lightning damage to attacks, damage with bow skills, or projectile speed, as we convert projectile speed into damage thanks to feathered fletching. For the suffixes, critical hit chance to attacks, critical damage bonus for attack damage, and projectile skill levels are the ideal set. But projectile skill levels are extremely expensive, so I recommend substituting attack speed in instead, which will still improve your clear speed without increasing your mana costs for a much cheaper price. On your amulet, 35 spirit or more is ideal to have the spirit required for both your Rhoa and cannibalism. Everything else is much less important, but prefixes like maximum life and increased percent evasion are nice to have. For the suffixes, the best by far is +2 to 3 projectile skill levels, but this is extremely overpriced currently, so I recommend any combination of critical hit chance, critical hit damage, or any combination of elemental resistances or attributes you may need. When anointing your amulet with distilled emotions, instill critical exploit as a cheap option, or storm charged if you're willing to invest a bit more currency into your amulet. For the rest of your gear, the top priority is going to be capping your elemental resistances at 75% each. You'll accomplish this by using suffixes in the majority of your gear we're about to talk about, and everything is secondary to accomplishing this goal. Close behind this goal is getting as close as possible to 2000 maximum life or more. You can certainly function with less, but don't be surprised if you get one shot. For one of your rings, an implicit that grants some amount of fire, cold, lightning, or all elemental resistances will likely be required. On the prefixes, you want any combination of physical damage to attacks, lightning damage to attacks, percent lightning damage, and if possible, maximum life. Suffixes should include elemental resistances as we talked about, but it's unlikely you'll want to afford a ring this perfect so early in the league. So shoot for 3 to 4 ideal lines and call it a day for now. For your other ring, we're going to be running our first unique, the Death Rush. This ring gives us the onslaught buff for 4 seconds on kill, granting us a 20% attack speed and 10% movement speed buff as long as we manage to keep up our momentum, greatly improving map clear capability, and it's also very cheap on top. If you want to spend a little bit more, then search for one with either a critical damage bonus corruption or attack speed corruption. If you're facing off against a pinnacle boss, Onslaught won't be available, so switch this ring out for another ring with ideal prefixes instead. The next piece I want to talk about is going to be our second unique, Leopold's Applause. This fairly cheap pair of gloves gives us 10% elemental penetration. And while ordinarily penetration can only lower an enemy's resistance to 0, these gloves allow you to penetrate enemy resistances down to a minimum of negative 50%. Because we stack an excessive amount of penetration, these gloves end up being a 50% overall increase to our damage, far more than any other pair of gloves could possibly provide. They do have a pretty high intelligence requirement, so you'll need to find some intelligence in a suffix or rune, but these gloves will be well worth it for the damage increase. Ideally, you want a heavy belt for the increase to stun threshold, as it'll make it more difficult to fall off of your Rhoa. But if that isn't a concern, any base is just fine. The only rules we really need to worry about with our belt this early in the league are maximum life as a prefix and as much elemental resistances as possible for the suffixes. Belts with 3 resistances in the suffix section will be pretty expensive this early, so shoot for 2 resistances and a maximum life roll of at least 100, then call it a day. For the helmet, body armor, and boots, we'll be using full evasion bases, as hybrid simply doesn't scale as well for Deadeye, and sacrificing any points in the passive tree to facilitate hybrid energy shield just isn't worth it, especially with the addition of deflection and the evasion rework. For the boots, the most important prefix is going to be movement speed, ideally 25% or more to get you started. Other ideal prefixes include maximum life, flat evasion, or percent evasion, and the suffixes should be used entirely for elemental resistances. So shoot for 2 out of 3 of these slots containing fire, cold, or lightning resistance. Your helmet prefixes should contain maximum life, flat evasion, and percent evasion, but 2 of the 3 will do just fine. And just like the boots, your suffixes should primarily be used for elemental resistances if possible, but you can also sneak a critical hit chance line in here if you want. And finally, for the body armor, the prefixes should include maximum life and as much evasion as physically possible. Ideally, 1500 or more to capitalize on our bestial skin notable. If you were unable to get an amulet with spirit, then you're going to need to use a chest piece with spirit instead of maximum life to compensate. For the suffixes, resistances or attributes are ideal, but the prefixes are much more important with this piece, so don't worry about a couple dead suffix lines this early on in the league. As far as how your rune sockets should be utilized, socket in iron runes if your bow is more heavily weighted towards physical damage, and storm runes if it's more lightning based. For armor, use your rune sockets to cap out your elemental resistances first and foremost. Then use iron runes to boost your body armor's evasion, and use any extras to fulfill stat requirements as necessary. That's more or less everything you need to know to get geared up and blast your way to tier 15 maps without any issues. The written version of this guide is also completed and available on Mobalytics linked below. If you want to know exactly what gear I'm personally running, you can also find that information under the Live Gear tab on the site. If you have any questions you'd like answered about the build, come ask me live at twitch.tv/Aravan anytime, and I'll be happy to help you out. Thanks for watching till the end, and to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going. Watch out for the next guide where I'll be elevating the build to take down all the pinnacle bosses and encounters while scaling into the deep endgame.